welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. We are going back to the Week of Indonesia Netherlands Education Research Seminar. And today we will talk about the space technologies for equal and sustainable digital societies. Of course, we see lots of news on how space technologies are um, currently being used by various states, both for civilian use and for military use. And however, we are currently seeing also that even though space technology has becoming more and more accessible in recent times, um, such accessibility is still quite limited, particularly for companies or persons who want to access those space technologies who are coming um, from um, developing states. So today we are going to have a discussions about the space technologies for equal and sustainable digital societies. Joining us today are three speakers. First one is Professor Alice Gorman, who are currently associate professor on humanities, arts, and social sciences from Flinders University, Australia. She is an expert in space archaeology. What is space archaeology, and what will Professor Gorman speak about today? Now we will hear from her directly. And the second speaker will be Professor Hikmanto Juwana. Professor Hikmanto is he was my supervisor when I did my bachelor, and also currently we are working together at the University of Indonesia. He is currently the professor of international law from the University of Indonesia, and currently the rector of Universitas Jenderal Ahmad Yani. And finally, the third speaker will be Yohana Bratu, who is currently assistant professor and also a research associate at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. I am inviting for all the speakers to come to the stage. Yeah. Professor Gorman, or should I call you Alice and Joanna?
Please just call me Alice.
Perfect. So, good afternoon to you. And of course, I forgot to mention good morning to Joanna and people who are joining this seminar today from the Netherlands. Yeah, it's currently quite early in the morning, right?
Relatively early, 9 a.m. So it's a good time for a conference online.
Of course, of course. So, Joanna, maybe I'm inviting you to present your material first, and what's your take on how to have these space technologies accessible equally and or sustainably in these modern digital societies? Please, Joanna.
Thank you very much, Alif, and welcome everyone. I will now start to share my screen before I start. I'm not sure if you can see.
Not yet.
Maybe now something?
Yeah. Well, it's quite an inception in here. Yeah, we can see your slides clearly now.
Now, can you see my slides?
Of course, yes.
Okay, I'll switch on to presenting mode. And you can still see my slides, right?
Yes, you can see it clearly.
Okay. Thank you. So once again, welcome everyone. My name is Joanna Bratu. I'm here on behalf of Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and specifically part of the AI and Space Law Society, a new initiative at our faculty that I will take 1 minute to speak about. My topic will be focused more on the applying international space law and also Dutch space law related to liability, so trying to mitigate potential risks that the introduction of emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence are posing to the current legislation in force. Just a brief introduction about myself. So I am currently based in the Netherlands, where I am introducing the study of space law at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and recently a similar approach in France at Paris, where again I am introducing the study of space law, part of master law programs offered by Université Paris Cité. I'm also a founder of the AI and Space Law Society, as briefly mentioned earlier. This is a new initiative based in Amsterdam, but is meant to act as an international organization, gathering experts in the field of space law, but also multidisciplinary experts in the field of artificial intelligence, governance, but also technical experts. And we're joining forces in order to promote the study of space law, but not necessarily the traditional way of studying space law, but the study of space law taking in consideration the latest developments posed by the ongoing evolution of artificial intelligence. And long story short, before joining academia in the Netherlands in 2019, so before that I was a corporate lawyer at various international law firms. What we see, so the latest developments that we are noticing are related to the fact that artificial intelligence, so various AI systems are starting to be increasingly used in space-related activities. So artificial intelligence has not only become part of our digital lives on Earth, this emerging technology is now also introduced in various domains related to space-related activities. In these space-related activities, the use of artificial intelligence is incorporating various levels of autonomy, and this is actually becoming standard. Various levels of autonomy or increased autonomy is becoming standard in what concerns space-related activities. And I have included here some brief examples just to familiarize the audience with what I mean exactly when I am saying that artificial intelligence is used in space-related activities. So examples include autonomous mission planning, space exploration, in particular deep space missions, such as traveling to Mars, autonomous satellite collision avoidance or avoidance of collisions between satellites and space debris, moon exploration, Earth observation, such as climate change or crew assistance. Of course, the utilization of this emerging technology does not come without legal challenges. And one of these challenges, which has been on the agenda of both legal and technical professionals, refers to the actual definition of the term artificial intelligence. At the policy level, various international organizations such as OECD, but also at the European level, various regulatory bodies have been struggling for more than a decade to offer a comprehensive definition of this term. One of the latest initiatives in the field refers to the Artificial Intelligence Act, which is a proposal for a regulation issued by the European Commission in 2021. And here the European Commission offers a proposal for defining this term using a very broad definition encompassing both narrow AI systems, but also advanced artificial intelligence equipped with a high degree of autonomy. The problem with this definition was that it has been highly criticized by the international community, by technical experts, but also by the legal experts, mentioning that the term is too broad and might lead to legal uncertainty. Of course, for the purpose of time, we do not have the possibility today to discuss any further, but I just wanted to give a brief introduction about what's happening in terms of legislative initiatives related to defining the actual term. Due to the introduction, due to the high interest of various stakeholders in introducing artificial intelligence in space-related activities, of course, there are also various risks involved, and one of them is strongly related to the concept of the human in the loop, or specifically the absence of human intervention in the deploying autonomous AI systems in various space-related activities. And one of the main concerns is related to liability, specifically who will be liable in case a damage is caused by a space object equipped with AI capabilities. And I will briefly try to answer this question. Of course, we do not have a clear-cut solution due to the let's say, vagueness of the legislation, but we can, of course, engage and try to propose potential solutions in this respect. And for doing this, I will now briefly mention the legal basis of space liability. I will briefly introduce the Outer Space Treaty and the Convention on International Liability for Damage Caused by Space Objects. The Outer Space Treaty is the so-called Magna Carta of space law, the Constitution of space law, one of the most important documents related to space law. It contains the core principles of space law, and it is widely implemented by all spacefaring countries and other countries participating in space-related activities. Therefore, it is the most important document when we are talking about the body of law regulating human activities in the outer space. Article 7 of the Constitution of Space Law, so Article 7 of the Outer Space Treaty, introduces the concept of international liability for states causing damage to another state due to the deployment of space objects in the outer space. And briefly, the Article 7 mentions that each state that launches or procures a launching, or from whose territory or facility a space object is launched, will be international liable for damage. Further, the Liability Convention extends the provisions of the Outer Space Treaty by introducing in a new document, in a new convention, or differently put, in a new international treaty, two different liability regimes. Article 2 of the Liability Convention mentions that a launching state shall be absolutely liable to pay compensation for damage caused by its space object if the damage is caused on the surface of the Earth or to aircraft in flight. The next article, Article 3, refers to fault-based liability, and it mentions that if damage is caused elsewhere, so not on the surface of the Earth or to aircraft in flight, so elsewhere than on the surface of Earth, liability will be conditioned by fault. So depending on the geographical location of damage, we have two different liability regimes in place. I will briefly also mention what are the key liability terms, the key space liability terms introduced by the Liability Convention, and those are the launching state, the space object, and damage. Each of them are defined by the Liability Convention. Some of them are more detailed, as you can see. The others are rather vague. One of the most controversial component of the Liability Convention is related to definition of the term space object, which is defined as including component parts of a space object as well as its launch vehicle and parts thereof. As you may see, the definition is rather general, leaving the possibility of interpretation, And yeah, the legal scholars are highly debating about what it should be included in the space object and what it should not be included in the space object. And I'll briefly refer to this in a minute when I will discuss the challenges that artificial intelligence, the deployment of artificial intelligence might pose to these key space liability terms. As mentioned, I will briefly mention these challenges. So first of all, as a rule, liability for damage attributable to states is traceable to human actions or omissions. Now, in the context of how artificial intelligence is envisaged as being introduced in space-related activities, specifically due to the fact that high degree of autonomy will be deployed, it might be difficult to trace a potential damage to the actions of a specific state. Now, related to the notion of space object, in the legal doctrines of the legal scholars have tried to interpret this by mentioning that it includes installations, equipment, material, payloads, fragments, or space junk, but it is unclear if such interpretations can be extended to AI software, so to the AI capabilities of such space objects. Further challenges may be related to the notion of fault. So a decision made by an advanced AI system might not be interpreted as being the fault of persons, which is specifically provided by the provisions of the Liability Convention. And lastly, liability implies foreseeability. But in some cases, it cannot be assessed how an AI system made a certain decision. This is also related to the black box phenomenon of AI systems, which that sometimes are not transparent enough in order for experts to be able to understand how a certain decision was achieved by an advanced AI system. In our task of trying to mitigate or to understand and to propose potential solutions related to these challenges, I have tried to look into national solutions, specifically national space law. And I will briefly mention the Dutch approach to space law and the Dutch approach to space liability. Specifically, I will briefly introduce the Dutch Space Activities Act entered into force in 2008. So the Dutch space legislation introduces a flexible licensing system. Various conditions are imposed to operators that require to be observed in order to obtain the license required for undertaking space-related activities. I have investigated the acts, so the Dutch national space legislation specifically related to liability provisions, and I have found in Chapter 4, mainly redress. There are several provisions useful for operators. For example, mandatory insurance is introduced as being mandatory, and the liability will be capped, is limited, related to the provisions of the license. As anticipated, and unfortunately, there are no special provisions on liability for damage caused by space objects equipped with AI capabilities. So the challenges that we already identified in previous slides, the challenges that the introduction of AI may pose to the key space liability terms, are not solved by the Dutch Space Act. In order to think ahead, to brainstorm about what would be other potential solutions, my research at the moment shows three alternative solutions. So one would be supplementing the Liability Convention. However, I am quite skeptical that this is possible due to the complex endeavor that this might entail from a political perspective. the signing of and the negotiation of the Outer Space Treaty, as well as the Liability Convention, took a lot of time. Many interests collided during the negotiations. So although from a theoretical legal perspective, this is of course possible, it might be very difficult to be achieved in the near future and also on a long term. Another possible solution, which might seem easier to achieve, would be supplementing national legislation. For example, the Dutch Space Act could be amended in order to reflect the technological advancements from a particular country, in our case, the Netherlands or Indonesia or another country that has already implemented national legislation. Another approach refers to the rules of the road. Specifically a non-abiding approach, guidance that can be used at the national level, but also at the international level in terms of how states should approach the implementation of artificial intelligence in space-related activities. The disadvantage for this proposal, for this potential solution, would be that it is non-binding. Therefore, there will not be clear enforcement mechanism for states who decide in the end not to observe the guidelines. Before the end of my presentation and before thanking you for your attention, I would like to mention that the findings that I have mentioned in this presentation are related to a strong collaboration that Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam has with the Universitas Indonesia, and I would like to refer you to a journal article, Autonomous Space Objects and International Space Law Navigating the Liability Gap, which was written by a group of experts from Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, but it was published by the Indonesian Journal of International Law last year in 2021. I would also like to mention an ongoing capacity building grant developed by Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, led by the law faculty on behalf of a multidisciplinary team of experts at Universitas Indonesia. And of course, we are actively also engaging in other activities such as the one from today, and we are open for future plans and for a sustainable partnership together with our colleagues from Universitas Indonesia. And I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward for your comments and, of course, also feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for your presentation, and it's very enlightening, and also it raises for me at least it raises some questions about the application to liability convention and also the Dutch national law, particularly when we are discussing about the accessibility of space technologies, for example, for developing states and also for new emerging companies, startups, and everything. Of course, when we take into consideration the possible or probable effect of their activities, um, both in the outer space, be it in the outer space, and also from during the launch procedure, something can happen, and also something that can and will happen, may happen and affect various parties, and that's why the liability convention come into fruition. In your opinion, what do you think, or how's the liability convention taking into consideration the ability of developing states or space companies, new space companies coming from developing states, because they have very limited resources, and also they have very limited financial resources, be it for the to build their own technology and to pay insurances, and how do you think the liability convention see this issue?
First of all, thank you for your question, Alif. This is a debate very important, and at all international conferences we are currently engaging in discussions about this. I would mostly refer maybe better to the spirit of the Outer Space Treaty, so to the spirit of the Constitution of Space Law, which is actually a document drafted and negotiated in the 50s, so in 1957, but its spirit is still present also today in 2022, and the Outer Space Treaty specifically provides that the access to space exploration and the access to the outer space should be on an equal basis. It will not, there will be no barriers in terms of emerging countries accessing space-related activities. It will be performed on an equal basis. There will be no discrimination between states. So the spacefaring countries, the states ratifying the Outer Space Treaty, also agreed with another provision of the Outer Space Treaty in terms of informing each other in terms related to space-related activities. States also agreed to collaborate. So international cooperation and the applicability of international law are explicitly provided in the provisions of the Outer Space Treaty. And I know that the answer is more from a legal perspective. And I think your question was more related to how we can achieve this kind of, so how we can achieve international cooperation in practice. And one of the solutions actively discussed by the international community is maybe related to a quota. Maybe states will agree to have a quota of participation in order to enable emerging countries or countries with limited access to financial resources also to be actively involved in space-related activities. Of course, there are also downsides of implementing such a quota. Some states and some other private stakeholders are referring to the concept of positive discrimination in terms that, okay, we shouldn't force this, we should enable access to space-related activities in a different way. I think there are multiple solutions that can be achieved, but the most important component is states actively communicating, states actively engaging. The public dialogue should also be there, and this is one of the main reasons why I find it very important for us space lawyers, space attorneys to be present and to actively advocate for this. And I hope this is what we're doing here today.
Yeah. And also I want to ask a follow-up question if that's fine to you. Since we are previously we are seeing it through the lens of the international community, now I think I want to ask more about the Dutch national law, particularly during my time studying in the Netherlands. I have seen that there are emerging numbers of space companies being instituted or created in the Netherlands. So, how does the Dutch national law encourage the building of these space companies, and how does the Dutch national law sustain or and also help these companies for their activities, and also trying to anticipate if something should happen? For example, there is some sort of a fallback mechanism or safer liability mechanism.
Absolutely. So I will answer this in a pragmatical Dutch manner, although I'm not Dutch, and I will just say that the Netherlands embraces a pragmatic approach when it comes to space activities. They are actively collaborating with other stakeholders, so with the European Space Agency mostly. But there is indeed a strong startup sector for Dutch activities, which is also supported by the government. And the fact that the Netherlands, even if the Netherlands, yeah, it's not a big spacefaring country, but the fact that so the Dutch government decided to implement national space legislation ever since 2008, I think it already says a lot. And the same pragmatism that I was mentioning I have also noticed it in the provisions of the national space legislation, in terms that, okay, the liability is kept, and the fact, as also mentioned in the presentation, the fact that insurance is mandatory in order to obtain the license. That is also a component that potentially ensures legal certainty. There is also a redress mechanism included in the legislation. So, in accordance with the provisions of the Liability Convention and in accordance with the provisions of the Outer Space Treaty, specifically Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty provides that states are internationally responsible for the national activities of their uh, so for their national activities in the outer space, but also for the activities of non-governmental actors. So states are bearing responsibility related to this. And in fact, Article 6 is the legal basis in accordance to which states are implementing national legislation in order for them to be covered in case something, in case a damage is caused or any other losses related to space-related activities. So, and this is what the Netherlands did in 2028. They said, okay, we have Article 6, we also have Article 7 of the Outer Space Treaty. Let's implement national legislation in order for us to be in control in case the private sector is developing. And that is what is happening these days. So the Dutch perfectly anticipated the developments in the sector. And by implementing a redress mechanism in their national legislation, the states, so the Dutch states is basically covered in case something goes wrong related to a private activity in the outer space. There is a redress mechanism. There will be an insurance policy in place, and that presumably offers a certain degree of legal certainty. Not entirely, because as mentioned, so again, I need to go back to the definition of the space object. We've seen how vague it is. There are many interpretations. And another component, in addition to the vagueness of the provisions of the Liability Convention, is the absence of state practice. So we do not have an entire list of cases implementing the Liability Convention. We do not have a lot of state practice. So we can say that we are just at the beginning of the road, but the discussion and the dialogue, once again, are very important for us to be prepared, for us to anticipate, for us to be able, in case something happens, to be able to find solutions, and not only from a reactive perspective. These discussions about the provisions of the Liability Convention, the Outer Space Treaty, and the discussions about the national space legislation are also very important in order to see what can be improved. So we should not necessarily wait to react. We might want to start now to see how we can amend these laws, these pieces of legislation, in order to be covered in case actually something happens.
Yeah, Joanna, thank you for your answer. Of course, building a new international law regime for everything, especially for space law, it seems to be difficult nowadays because we
Absolutely.
are following the debate and at the COP was just about the determination of where does the boundaries between air and space, where does air ends and where does space starts. Even that small debate has becoming has been dragging for a long time at the COPOS. So I think I agree with what you said at the end. In order to develop it, is we need to make more non-binding mechanism, but at least not uh, exactly non-binding, but too broad. But maybe possibly non-binding, but at least giving states chance to commit themselves into some sort of mechanism to ensure the accessibility. So there is one question, but maybe this question will be answered after we hear the second speaker from Professor Alice Gorman. So I'm inviting now Professor Alice to join the panel. So Alice, good afternoon from Jakarta and also from Australia as well. So today you will be as a space archaeology. So how do you see uh, the accessibility of space technology for equal and sustainable digital society? Maybe I will give you about 10 to 15 minutes to present your material.
Thank you, Aleph, and I'm very delighted to be here today participating in this conference. Apologies in advance for the state of my voice, which is not particularly good at the moment. But as Aleph said, I'm a space archaeologist. I work on the human material culture that has taken us into space. But my original profession was as a cultural heritage manager working with Indigenous people in Australia. And that's the theme I'd like to pick up on today. So is it possible to get my first slide up, please? Thank you. So I'd like to start as well with the Australian tradition of offering an acknowledgement of country. So I'm joining you today from the land of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and I would like to extend my respects to their elders, past and present, and also extend that respect to the traditional owners of the countries from which anyone in the audience might be joining us today. So my work with Indigenous communities in Australia has led me to consider how their contemporary lives intersect with space technology. And something that is an issue that arose with the first computers and is still very strong and current today is that of the digital divide, although sometimes the concept is turned on its head. Instead of talking of the divide, we talk about making things digitally inclusive. And of course, our digital world today is very dependent on satellite technologies. So the digital divide exists in a number of ways. It's basically about the difference between those who have access to internet, telecommunications, and other digital technologies and those who don't. One of the big aspects of this divide is a division by gender. So we know in some parts of the world that men are 90% more likely to own a smartphone than are women. When women do own a smartphone, they may not have as much access to the internet. And of course, when women are in online spaces, they're often subject to very high levels of particularly sexualized abuse. So that's a very strong aspect of the digital divide. We also have a geographic divide. So often people in rural areas have less access than people in urban areas. And between the global north and the global south, there is often far less access to satellite-based telecommunications and internet services in so-called developing or emerging nations. So the divide is also very much split up along an axis of wealth. What I want to pick up on particularly today is how the digital divide exists in relation to Indigenous communities, particularly in settler nations such as Australia is. Another aspect of this is what's been called digital colonialism. So in countries like Australia and Canada, North America, many other nations around the world, there was an initial phase of colonialism by European nations starting from around the 17th century onwards. So you have the imposition of an external rule, which often places Indigenous people into an inferior or a lesser status. So the advent of particularly satellite-based telecommunications technologies has been called a second wave of colonialism, which this time is not enforced by governments and armies, but is driven by content and advertising. So we've seen a number of debates arise around this. One elder from North Canada called it the neutron bomb effect, something that destroys people but leaves buildings standing. So many have argued that Indigenous cultures have been threatened by the availability of dominant content particularly from Europe and North America. And so this has posed a threat to passing on knowledge and maintaining culture in its strength. The use of advertising and web-based industries has also been a threat to local industries, particularly through the big giants, Google, Facebook, Netflix. And in some countries, there has been a lot of conflict as small local industries are driven to the margins by those run by these enormous companies. So merely having access, once we cross that digital divide and we get access to all of this information, it doesn't automatically mean everybody has equal opportunities, and it doesn't automatically promote equal and sustainable societies. However, what I want to talk about now is two examples which provide a very positive countermodel, if you like. And these are how Indigenous communities have used satellite technologies to strengthen their cultures and to gain power. One of these is in Australia. So in 1982, the Australian government acquired its first telecommunications satellites. They were built elsewhere, although they were operated from Australia. And the early ones were the AusSat series, which were then succeeded by the Optus series. So these satellites meant for the first time that Indigenous communities in the north of Australia would have access to television, for example, coming out of literally nowhere. So they would be exposed to advertising, for example, without any cultural context to necessarily make good decisions. So there was a lot of debate at the time about what the impacts of satellite television would be on remote Indigenous communities in Australia. And one organisation, the Central Australian Aboriginal Media Association, which had been running since 1980, decided to take matters into their own hands. So when a downlink licence for broadcast became available in 1988, they bid for it and they won it. And this ended in establishing Imparja, which is an Indigenous-owned and run satellite television station. On the side, you can see the red areas on Australia are places where Imparja is available. So Imparja had a specific mandate to include Indigenous content and to focus on Indigenous news and sports and stories. There's, again, a lot of debate about how successful they've been in doing that, but it has made a huge difference with a flow-on effect to other commercial television stations who are now forced to be more sensitive in their inclusion of Indigenous material and often to have specific policies about how much they include. So this has had a very positive effect, and this has been in place since the 1980s. Another great example of using satellite technologies for the empowerment of Indigenous communities is also in the telecommunications realm, starting slightly earlier. In 1976, the Canadian government launched Anik A and Hermes, which were experimental telecom satellites specifically to cater for far north Indigenous communities in Canada. And interestingly, Anik A and Anik B, which you see on the slide, the same design as Indonesia's first satellites, Palapa A1 and Palapa A2. Pretty much looked identical to this. So the success of this satellite network led in 1992 to the establishment of Television Northern Canada, which was a network owned by 13 Indigenous groups. And some years later, that morphed into the Aboriginal People's Television Network, APTN. So as with Imparja, the inclusion of Indigenous content had an impact in sustaining these communities, and it had that flow-on impact into other more mainstream television and digital content, in that they could no longer ignore the existence of Indigenous stories, and this led to sort of more inclusiveness and more policies to make that happen in mainstream television. So what's interesting about these two examples, I think, is how early they are and how successful they've been, and how these technologies have been used to sustain the strength of Indigenous culture. But we're in a different phase now. So Anamiki, which is a Canadian company, has discussed the impacts of the mega constellations on Indigenous cultures. And in this quote, for example, they're talking about SpaceX and the Starlink network. So if SpaceX has already shown it doesn't care about anyone else's rights in space, what does this mean for the rights of Indigenous people? Do they extend to low Earth orbit? Is SpaceX even considering Indigenous peoples? And I think the answer to that is probably no. What about the rest of the solar system? Why not? Indigenous peoples are among the earliest astronomers. Why aren't we being consulted on any of this? Do we not have a right to the sky as well? So the mega constellations have produced a new level of debate around the impacts of greater access to digital content and the internet, which doesn't automatically lead to greater equality. However, satellite technologies continue to be used in support of Indigenous communities. And in Australia, for example, Earth observation data is used in caring for country, the Indigenous term for land management. It's also been used to document, map, and monitor cultural heritage sites. This kind of data can help people reconnect with their country. Satellite data is very visual. It's a way of repatriating knowledge. It's of creating connections back to places that people can't necessarily go. And satellite telecommunications are being used to keep languages alive by extending the communities who can participate in them. Perhaps most importantly, television, telecommunications, and internet, where Indigenous people can control the content, can be used to tell their own stories and to tell those stories more widely. So I think we have, as we're entering this new phase of commercial space, I think we have some really interesting threats to the sustainability of Indigenous cultures, but also, as in Australia at least, Aboriginal people have always been at the forefront of using smartphone technology and satellite content. I think there are a lot of opportunities to strengthen Indigenous communities and cultures as we head into this new phase of space exploration, extending even to the moon. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention. And I can maybe take a question now or leave them until we get to the end of the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice, for the enlightening presentation. I noticed you also highlighted several issues in the rising use of technology, particularly about the inclusivity of technology and also the existence of some form of new colonialism in the digital age, particularly on how mass-produced contents and its impact to local content and other local industries, and also its threat to Indigenous culture. Now, I'm really interested so much so that I want to ask one question. So, do you have any information about whether legal developments, for example, in Australia, anticipated the increasing use of technologies and its impact to the Indigenous people, particularly when you mentioned the initiative to create an Indigenous satellite and for the use of the Indigenous people? Does that mandated by law or coming from the Indigenous people themselves?
No, that's a great question. So at the moment, there's been a huge effort to include traditional owners and Aboriginal communities in the construction of space-related sites, such as launch sites and tracking stations and ground stations. That has perhaps not extended quite so often into greater levels of employment for local Indigenous communities, although that's kind of an ongoing effort. However, there's also been some great initiatives. So there's an Indigenous company that now owns some tracking stations. which are pulling down data from the Novasar satellite, which I had a picture of just before. But in general, most of this is kind of happening outside. Like there's no legal requirements to have a certain level of Indigenous ownership or Indigenous content. So things like the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and SBS have their own internal policies where they try to promote Indigenous content. But media laws in Australia, it's not quite my area of expertise, but media laws, and we do have, Rupert Murdoch to contend with, are often trying to water down local content, for example. So I would say, to my knowledge, there are no specific legal requirements to support Indigenous ownership or Indigenous content, but there's certainly been a lot of goodwill towards doing that. And I think like the Imparja license was led by Indigenous groups, but it was also supported by some of the big commercial players. So I think we've seen examples of sort of mainstream companies being quite keen to support Indigenous empowerment in this respect. But my feeling would be we can certainly do a lot more.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask one more question, then we move to the final speaker. So when you mentioned about the increasing launches coming from Australia, I noticed that Australia is currently building a commercial launch capabilities. So how does those commercial launch capabilities effort in including indigenous people and people who are actually in need of these technologies?
Well, interestingly, I think we've got about 5 launch sites under development at the moment, and I think about 4 of them are commercial. So the one people are likely to have heard of is Equatorial Launch Australia, which had some successful launches of NASA sounding rockets just in the last couple of months. But yeah, Australia is just completely going nuts for launch at the moment. So generally what's happened is, as part of environmental impact requirements, there has been a large involvement from traditional owners in managing the natural and cultural heritage of these places. There's also been, I think, efforts have been made to employ Indigenous companies in construction, for example, or other aspects of developing these sites. I'm not sure, or I'd be very happy for someone to have more information about this and prove me wrong. So I'm not sure if any of these companies are sort of specifically supporting Indigenous students to maybe get qualified in aerospace engineering, or, maybe to become the rocket engineers themselves. But there's certainly efforts being made to make sure that these launch sites are being done in a culturally appropriate way with adequate levels of consultation and also compensation being paid. So I think these are all good steps. In terms of having Indigenous people completely controlling their own satellites, or the other issue here, which is data sovereignty, owning data about them and their lands and their concerns. I'm not sure sort of how advanced we are on that front, but it's certainly it's a different era. Whereas when the Woomera rocket range was established in South Australia in 1947, it was seen as the space age naturally supplanting or succeeding the Stone Age, which was held to represent Aboriginal people. So people don't think like that anymore. There's more and more efforts to make sure that Indigenous communities are integrated into space industry. So that's very positive, but a lot of work still to be done.
Yeah, of course, we need to getting everything done, but small steps at a time. So thank you, Alice, for your presentation. Now we are supposed to hear a presentation from Professor Hikmahanto. However, I have just been informed that he's currently having technical issues in connecting to the stage, and also, however, fortunately, he has shared to us his short presentation, particularly um, on introducing the Indonesian space law, and also how it anticipated the um, rising use of space companies and also commercial space activities. Maybe I need some help to. Okay, so this is the presentation that was prepared by Professor Hikmahanto, particularly on the Indonesian space policy and legal framework and the pursuit for equity. So next slide. Okay, so the first one is the presentation was supposed to be divided into the three part: the international space law framework in a nutshell, of course, in Indonesian space law framework in a nutshell. Then coming to the challenges and opportunities for Indonesia to access the space market, and also finally how Indonesia can push effort in pursuing equity for its own space industry. So next slide, please. Yeah, as we all know, Indonesia hasn't yet ratified all of the um, international space law treaties, but at least Indonesia have ratified the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. We signed it in 1967, but ratified it in 2002, particularly for we didn't ratify it for 25 years due to our geostationary orbit sovereignty claim through the Bogota Declaration. But of course, various states, equatorial states, have abandoned this declaration um, in in the spirit of the international cooperation under the Outer Space Treaty. Coming second to the Registration Convention of 76, which Indonesia acceded in 97, and also the Liability Convention of 72. And finally, there are various legal framework of the International Telecommunications Union, be it the Constitution, radio regulation, and other relevant documents being implemented on every uh, World Radio Conference. So next slide. Yeah, so basically, when we talk about the Indonesian space law, or the law number 21 of 2013, there are five focus that we need to speak about when we in relation to um, equal and um, in relation to equal and sustainable digital societies. So basically, it is the first national space law implemented by Indonesia. Of course, it's trying to also implement Indonesia's international obligation through five focus, which are being stipulated by the law, that are space science, remote sensing or Earth observation, technological advancements, space launch, and commercial activities. And also, it mandated the creation of national space policy, which are being created to focus the Indonesian space activities, for which activities, be it for launch capabilities or for satellite remote sensing, etc. Now, another part of the law, it's set out the legal basis on the building of national spaceport. Of course, um, in recent news, we are currently seeing Indonesia's effort in creating its own uh, spaceport or a space launch facility in Papua. And finally, it codified the outer space principles, outer space treaty principles, rescue agreement, registration convention, and the liability convention within its stipulation. So next slide. Yeah. So what what is the Indonesian position on the commercial space activities? So basically, the Space Act of 2013 encouraged the formation of companies conducting space activities. Of course, these companies, of course, the Act also suggests the formation of the companies is needed to meet the national needs and strengthening international interests of Indonesia, and also to fulfill uh, the individual, or at least the need of the people in Indonesia. However, the formation of this company may be proved difficult considering too many scattered legal bases and procedures to establish relevant companies. So next slide. Yeah, so there are challenges that have been highlighted so far. First is the access of technology. Indonesia has limited access to space technology. We have been building our own satellites for communication, for Earth observation, and any other use. However, we still have not made our own launch capability, which will be needed in order to have our own space launch facility. Another problem that Indonesia has to face is access to finance. There are limited capital available for creating space companies or companies performing space activities. Aside from the limited capital, there are also problem on the regulatory framework on the economical aspect. So there are no financial solvency audit mandated to establish satellite operating companies or for space companies in general. And finally, there are currently limited political will from various stakeholders in Indonesia informing a clear national space policy. So these are, of course, aside from the problem, there are also opportunities in developing space industry in Indonesia. Next slide. So the several opportunities that have been highlighted by the professor are Indonesia's geographical location for spaceport. Of course, we know Indonesia is situated along the equatorial line, so it is perfect for space launch of space object into space. Of course, Indonesia is currently pursuing this plan and trying to build a spaceport in Biak in Papua, and also there are opportunities in exploring and exploiting raw materials needed to sustain a space activities. And finally, there are in terms of satellites, there are geostationary orbit slots allocated for Indonesia, which are currently being unused, and space companies who are eager to use it for their activities in Indonesia can apply to the Indonesian government, provided that they are coordinating it with the International Telecommunications Union. So next slide. Yeah, so there are several ways that Indonesia for be able to pursue equity for uh, access to developing space technology and developing international space law. So Indonesia can internally create their own rules or make clearer rules in relation to the establishment of space companies, and also creating clearer links between the National Space Act and other relevant rules in forming companies. That has to be done internally, and also most importantly, um, creating a focused national space policy. And for the external effort that Indonesia can pursue is the proposing preferential treatments for developing countries in obtaining orbital allocation, for example, or proposing an international or regional funds to be made to fund commercial space activities in developing countries. Now, I highlighted this second part because it is closely relating to Ioana's answer earlier about creating an international cooperation in funding activities for developing states. So next slide. I think this is the last one. Yeah, so these are the three questions that we need to think about carefully. So do Indonesia need to focus its national space policy to just one or two space activities in building our own national space policy, or does the existing national law enough for equitable access to establish space company or conducting space activities from Indonesia? And finally, does the existing international law encourages equitable access for developing states in conducting space activities? So, of course, these are the questions that cannot just be answered in one seminar. It's a question that should be answered over a long period of time. So, I think these are the presentation prepared by Professor Hikmahanto, and maybe I will invite I will take off the speaker hat and putting on the moderator hat again. I'm going to invite Joanna and Alice back to the stage. Yeah. Okay. So in discussing about the on how we give access to space activities for these new digital societies. So, what do you think about a form of international cooperation that it needs to be done? Of course, there are several stakeholders outside of states that we need to take into account. Joanna and Professor Ikmanto earlier highlighted the access for space companies, and also Alice highlighted the access for indigenous people. So, at least how do we pursue this pursue this effort in order to include everyone in for them to access, or at least for them to be able to use space activities equally.
Can I perhaps leap in first with something that's not quite directly in answer to your question, Aleph, but I think it's worth mentioning that Indonesia has a very long history in space. So Palapa A1 was launched in 1976, which is among sort of the earliest satellite programs that are outside what are now considered to be the big spacefaring nations. And that satellite series had the very explicit aim of uniting, people will know this better than me, but there's something like 3,000 islands that make up Indonesia, and a very large number of languages. So the early Palapa satellite program, had an explicit aim to be a unifying technology and to create a sense of community amongst all those languages and islands. And I think it's a very significant satellite industry, and it's worth remembering that Indonesia has this very long history. And incidentally, Palapa A1 is still in orbit as a piece, as Indonesia's oldest piece of space heritage outside the Earth.
Yeah, of course. If we, yeah, Joanna, please.
Just I think to build on what Alice mentioned, and just to give an example of another project that the two of us are involved. So I think I can proudly mention that the group organized by the Moon Village Association, the Global Expert Group on Sustainable Lunar Activities, organized by the international NGO Moon Village Association. And the way it was organized, I think it can, the way it was set up, I think it can in theory offer a model of collaboration. So we are a team of experts from all over the world. So planet Earth is represented from Australia, the Netherlands, China, Japan, I think, Germany. So the European Union is represented. The other continents are also there. And yes, there are struggles, but we do manage to sit at the same table and to find solutions. And so the core component of the group was to bring international experts with first of all, with various backgrounds from a cultural perspective, but also multidisciplinary backgrounds in terms of legal experts, technical experts, business administration experts, archaeologists, specialists in social sciences. The multidisciplinary component always needs to be perceived from various perspectives. So not only related to your educational background, but also to your cultural background. And we have been closely working for almost 2 years, I think, and it is possible. It is possible to sit at the same table, to navigate the difficulties of time zones, to navigate the interests of our home countries or the interests of our institutions. It is possible to sit at the same table and to brainstorm about sustainable practices in outer space, about building future human habitats on the moon. So it is possible, but it needs to be, I think, a very important role in achieving this lies upon developed countries. So developed countries need to be active and moreover proactive in engaging and facilitating access for countries for countries that have different possibilities, different access to space technology, and different possibilities in engaging in space-related activities. Um, I'm not an optimist in my nature, but seeing it, and I was rather skeptical that such an endeavor can be possible. But I'm looking in the past at the last 2 years, and yes, again, we see the difficulties and the cultural barriers sometimes, but it is doable and it is possible. And I think it is the responsibility um, in each of us active in space-related activities, irrespective of our background, to speak about this and to bring people together and to show that it is possible.
Okay, so I think I can take two major points coming from both Alice and Joanna. So basically, in order for us to include various stakeholders in order to access space technologies and also maybe artificial intelligence as such, we need to have some sort of a palapa spirit, that is to um, uh, to create one landmark program that could um, that could include various stakeholders. And in order to prepare this program, there needs to be some form of international cooperation in order to create and sustain this program, particularly because if we just force developed states to just fund this program from developing states, it will be difficult because every state has their own needs and everything. But I think um, efforts coming from outside of the state systems, international legal systems, maybe prove way easier. I think more achievable, if that's what your points say, Joanna. Is that
Absolutely, absolutely, Alif. I think you have captured the essence of this panel today, and um, I see our colleagues are telling us that we have only a couple of minutes left, and I would like to take the opportunity to, uh, first of all, to thank Alice for joining the panel from again from a different time zone. So it's absolutely fascinating that yeah, so we are all over the place. We're in Indonesia, the Netherlands, and also in Australia. But I think this is of course at the micro level, an example of how in space we speak the same language. It sounds metaphorical, but it has a very real component. So we speak the same language. We have the spirit of the Outer Space Treaty that should be guiding us, and we are here from various continents, and we are aiming towards the same goals. I would also like to thank Alif for coordinating and for managing the panel in an exceptional manner. I will leave it up to you, Alif, if there is still time for questions that you would like me or Alice to answer.
okay? So maybe there's only one question currently on my board right now. There is a question about this course of charging navigation service fees to
Yes,
consumers directly. What are the pros and cons when we talk about equitable access or equity for various stakeholder in space
I can.
technologies?
Yeah, I can jump into that. I recognize Anas from the summer school. Thank you, Anas. You always have wonderful questions. And this is also a favorite topic of mine, liability for GNSS services. We don't have time to go into details. I recognize the discourse and how it all started briefly with the GPS offering services for free. Then the European Union with Galileo. Galileo is slowly but surely becoming operational, ensuring the autonomy of the European Union in terms of satellite services. Europe promised at a specific moment in time in the 90s when they started developing Galileo. So Europe promised via the European Union that they will assume liability for the services offered by Galileo. In my from my research, it seems that the discourse is changing. So now slowly the European Union is starting to see the risks in this respect, and it might be that in the end they will not assume liability for services. And the main reason invoked by both United States and at the European level is that, okay, if satellite services are offered for free, we cannot assume liability. I'm not sure if that is how the political discourse should be. In terms of charging GNSS service fees directly to consumers, this is where I wanted to arrive at the end. If you charge a fee, you also need to assume liability, right? Because it will be a service that you render to a consumer based on a fee, and then it needs to have a corresponding obligation, and corresponding obligations, and one of them will be assuming liability. So in the end, I think the approach would be different, not charging fees, but also not assuming liability. If this is the right way of engaging with consumers, it's a different discussion. But yeah, I hope I managed to answer the question very briefly. It's a complex and difficult topic.
Yeah, I think so too. Personally, I think topic of GNSS service and its fees is a very delicate subject that maybe needs another webinar to speak about. So I think
Absolutely.
I think to conclude, we can agree on that. We can do inclusivity and also creating space technologies for equal and sustainable digital societies for or through non-formal means, particularly to create it, some form of a palapa spirit that Alice mentioned earlier about creating a landmark program that could unite a country, or at least the international community, on certain subjects, and in this case equal opportunities and access to space technologies. So thank you for Ioana and Alice for participating in the seminar, and thank you also for Nufik for being able to facilitate us in conducting the seminar, and maybe we'll see each other again in another time. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.
And
Goodbye.
thank you, Aleph, for your excellent work in presenting Professor Hicks' material. That was very well done.
Absolutely. Thank you as well. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.